Welcome back. I've got a special story to share today.
Arthur Sterling laughed as he slid the architectural sketches across the mahogany table toward Julian Sterling in front of the entire firm's executive board. The sound was jovial, the kind of booming, chesty vibrato he saved for public triumphs, but to Maya Sterling, it sounded like the grinding of tectonic plates. She stood at the far end of the room, her back straight, her fingers curling into her palms until her nails bit into the skin. The sketches were hers. Every meticulous line, every daring cantilevered terrace, and every complex structural calculation for the new downtown skyline had been born in her studio during 18-hour shifts, while her brother was seen at gala openings and underground clubs. Julian has the vision to lead this legacy project into the next decade, Arthur said, his voice dripping with a practiced, patriarchal warmth. He didn't even look at his daughter. He gestured to the board members, men who had known him for 30 years and who nodded like clockwork. A project of this magnitude requires a sterling man at the helm. It's about the face of the company. Maya, your assistance to your brother in the drafting room has been adequate. We appreciate the clerical support. A ripple of polite, dismissive chuckles moved through the room. Maya felt the air grow thin. The scent of her father's expensive Cuban cigar drifted toward her, thick and suffocating, mingling with the sterile smell of floor wax and old money. She looked at Julian, who was currently adjusting his gold Rolex, the metal clinking against the glass tabletop with a heavy, arrogant sound. He didn't look at the blueprints. He looked at his reflection in the polished wood. "Thanks, Dad," Julian said, his smirk widening as he glanced toward his sister. "I'll make sure the world knows how well you can organize a folder, Maya. Maybe I'll even get you a commemorative plaque for the break room." "The Centurion project is the largest contract in the city's history," Maya said, her voice low and steady. It was the only thing in the room that didn't feel like it was made of glass. "It requires more than a face, Julian. It requires an understanding of the wind load variables on the north face and the specific zoning permits for the subterranean levels." Julian waved a hand dismissively. "Details, Maya. That's what we pay the little people for." Right now, the Sterling name needs a leader, not a math teacher. From the corner of the room, Eleanor Sterling adjusted her silk scarf, her eyes cold as she looked at her stepdaughter. "Do try to be a team player, dear. You look so tense. Perhaps that's why you chose such a functional outfit today. It hardly screams executive vice president, does it?" Maya glanced down at her charcoal blazer. It was functional because she spent her time on construction sites and overdrafting tables, not picking out pocket squares. The injustice of it was a physical weight, a pressure behind her eyes that she refused to let turn into tears. She watched as her father poured a glass of vintage scotch, the amber liquid swirling against the crystal. He handed it to Julian, a silent coronation in front of the most powerful stakeholders in the city. She reached into her pocket, her thumb brushing the cool, matte surface of an encrypted thumb drive. They thought she was the clerical support. They believed she was the dutiful daughter who would let her brother steal her genius to keep the family name untarnished. They didn't know that 3 months ago. She had registered the specific structural patents for the Centurion's unique foundation under a shell company called Alethea Holdings. "I see," Maya said, her voice devoid of the anger they expected. She saw the board members relax, thinking she had been properly cowed. "If the board is satisfied with Julian's vision, then I suppose my work here is finished for the day." "That's the spirit," Arthur said, finally sparing her a glance. It was a look of profound indifference. "Go get some rest. Julian and I have a press conference to prepare for. The city wants to see the man who's going to build their future." Maya didn't wait for a dismissal. She turned and walked out of the boardroom, the sound of her sensible heels clicking a sharp, rhythmic beat against the marble floor. She didn't head for her office. Instead, she walked toward the elevators, her heart hammering against her ribs like a trapped bird. As the doors slid shut, she saw Aunt Beatrice standing by the floor-to-ceiling windows in the lobby. Her father's sister was the only one who had ever looked at Maya and seen a person instead of a tool. Beatrice held a slim leather briefcase, her expression unreadable. "They did it, didn't they?" Beatrice asked as Maya approached. "He gave the centurion to Julian," Maya replied. "He called my work clerical support in front of the entire board." Beatrice handed her a single sheet of paper. It was a confirmation of the patent filings and the incorporation papers for a new firm. "Then the foundation is officially cracked, Maya. Arthur thinks he owns the Sterling name, but he forgot that names are just words. Ownership is in the fine print." Maya took the paper, her eyes scanning the legal seals. A small, cold smile touched her lips. She thought of Julian standing on that stage tomorrow, bragging about a design he couldn't explain, and her father betting the entire company's reputation on a lie. "The press conference is at 10 tomorrow morning," Maya said, her voice echoing in the quiet lobby. "And the injunction?" Beatrice asked. Maya looked at the thumb drive in her hand. "It's already scheduled for 10:05. If they want a Sterling man to be the face of the project, they're going to find out exactly what happens when that face has nothing behind it." She stepped out into the cool evening air, the city lights shimmering like a promise. She had been the shadow for too long. Tomorrow she was going to be the sun, and she was going to watch her father's empire melt. The next morning, the Sterling estate was a hive of manufactured prestige. Maya Sterling walked into the dining room, where the scent of expensive cedar and Julian's acidic espresso hung heavy in the air. Arthur Sterling didn't look up from his tablet, his thumbs scrolling through the morning's financial headlines with a practiced, predatory grace. "You're dressed early, Maya," he said, his voice as cold as the marble countertops. "I thought we agreed you'd be watching the live stream from the library." "This is Julian's moment. We can't have the narrative cluttered by distractions." Julian smirked, adjusting his silk tie in the reflection of a silver toaster. He looked every bit the part of the visionary architect, provided no one asked him to explain the structural load-bearing requirements of the Sterling spire. He reached for a folder on the table. The very blueprints she had spent 18 months perfecting in the basement office he called a storage room. He tapped the cover with a manicured finger. "Don't worry, Dad," Julian said, his voice dripping with unearned confidence. "Maya knows her place. She's the ghostwriter and I'm the bestseller. That's how the family business works, right? I've memorized the talking points. The press is going to eat this up." Maya felt the familiar heat of indignation rise in her throat, but she swallowed it down, replacing it with the icy calm Beatrice had instilled in her the night before. She reached into her handbag, her fingers brushing the smooth, cold surface of the thumb drive. "I wouldn't miss it for the world, Julian," she said, her voice steady. "I want to see exactly how you explain the cantilevered gardens. They're quite complex." Julian's smirk faltered for a fraction of a second, a flicker of genuine panic crossing his eyes before his arrogance shielded him again. "I'll manage. I'm a Sterling. We have a natural instinct for these things." "Instinct is no substitute for ownership," she murmured, though her father was already back to his headlines, dismissing her existence entirely. By 9:15 a.m., they were at the Sterling Plaza. The lobby was a sea of camera crews and reporters, the air buzzing with the electric hum of anticipation. Eleanor Sterling stood near the podium, her designer heels clicking sharply against the polished stone. She spotted Maya and frowned, her eyes scanning her stepdaughter's modest charcoal suit with visible distaste. "Maya, darling," Eleanor said, though there was no affection in the word. It sounded more like a diagnosis. "That suit is adequate for a clerk, but please stay behind the velvet ropes. We've invited the governor, and we can't have the press wondering why the help is hovering so close to the family photo." "I'll be exactly where I need to be, Eleanor," she replied. Maya Sterling stepped away, finding a quiet corner near the back of the hall. Her phone buzzed in her palm. It was a text from Leo Vance, the family's former head of legal who had been quietly waiting for a reason to settle his own score with Arthur. "The injunction is uploaded to the court's emergency portal," the message read. "The moment the clock hits 10:05, the digital cease and desist will hit every major news outlet's tip line simultaneously." The blueprints are legally flagged as stolen property. She looked up at the stage. Julian was practicing his smile for the cameras, and Arthur was shaking hands with a senator, his chest puffed out with the pride of a man who believed he had successfully buried his daughter's talent under his son's name. They looked invincible. They looked like kings. She checked her watch. 9:55 a.m. The air in the room felt thick, the scent of expensive floral arrangements and floor wax suddenly stifling. In 5 minutes, Julian would step onto that stage and claim her soul as his own. In 10 minutes, the world would find out that the sterling spire was built on a foundation of theft. 10 minutes, she whispered to herself, her heart hammering a steady, rhythmic countdown against her ribs. She watched her father take his seat in the front row, his back turned to her, oblivious to the fact that the shadow he had cast her into was about to become his own eclipse. 2 minutes later, the heavy velvet curtains of the Sterling ballroom groaned as they were pulled back, revealing a sea of expectant faces and the blinding glare of 100 camera flashes. Maya Sterling stood in the shadows of the wings, the scent of expensive stage fog and floor wax clinging to her skin. Her pulse was a steady, rhythmic thrum against her ribs, a stark contrast to the frantic energy vibrating off her brother. Julian Sterling adjusted his silk tie for the 10th time, his face flushed with a mixture of terror and unearned pride. He didn't look like a visionary architect. He looked like a boy wearing his father's suit, desperate for the world to believe the lie. "Stay out of the sightlines, Maya," Arthur Sterling commanded, stepping into the dim light beside her. He didn't look at his daughter. His eyes were fixed on the stage, on the podium where the Sterling name would soon be etched into the city's skyline. He reached out and straightened Julian's lapel with a firm, proprietary hand. "This is your brother's moment. Try not to cast a shadow on it with that sour expression of yours. You should be grateful we even let you into the VIP wing." "I'm exactly where I need to be, Father," she replied, her voice as cool as the marble floors beneath them. Arthur let out a sharp, dismissive huff. "You're here as a courtesy. Don't mistake proximity for importance. When Julian steps out there, he represents the future of this family. You're just the girl who helped with the filing." He turned away, his polished shoes clicking sharply on the plywood as he followed his son toward the bright lights. Maya watched them go, her fingers brushing the cold, hard plastic of the USB drive tucked into the hidden pocket of her blazer. It was a small weight, but it felt heavier than the entire building they were about to celebrate. "He still hasn't learned that the strongest foundations are the ones you can't see," a voice whispered from the darkness behind her. Maya turned to see Aunt Beatrice standing near a stack of equipment crates. The older woman looked regal in her charcoal suit, her silver hair shimmering under the dim utility lights. She leaned in, the faint scent of lavender and old parchment following her. She pressed a heavy, leather-bound ledger into Maya's hands. "The original hand-drawn schematics from your grandfather's private vault," Beatrice said, her voice barely audible over the rising roar of the crowd. "I checked the hidden watermarks myself. Every single structural innovation Julian is about to claim as his own is documented here, dated 3 years ago, under your signature. Arthur thought he burned these. He didn't realize I kept the keys to the off-site archives." Maya opened the ledger. The paper felt thick and textured, the ink of her own drawings a silent testament to the nights she'd spent bleeding her soul into the Sterling spire. "Does he have any idea?" "Arthur thinks he's playing a game of checkers," Beatrice said with a thin, sharp smile. "He has no idea you've already won the tournament. The legal flag on the blueprints went live at 9:50 a.m. The city's digital permitting office is currently processing a stolen intellectual property hold on the entire project. They won't stop the ceremony, but they'll freeze the construction permits within the hour." A sudden rustle of silk announced the arrival of a leaner Sterling. She swept into the wings, her diamonds catching the stray light and casting jagged reflections against the brick wall. She looked at Maya with a pitying tilt of her head, her nose wrinkling as if she detected a foul odor. "Still clutching those dusty old books, Maya?" Eleanor asked, her voice dripping with artificial sweetness. You really should have let the stylist look at you. That blazer is so functional. It's a shame, really. Today is a celebration of brilliance, and you look like you're ready to audit a tax return. Try to at least smile for the family portrait later. It would be a tragedy if people thought the help was unhappy. I'll be sure to find something to smile about, Eleanor, Maya said, her gaze unwavering. Eleanor patted her hair, a smug smirk playing on her lips. Good girl. Now move back. The senator is coming through, and we need the space for people who actually matter. Maya stepped back, merging with the shadows. She watched as Julian stepped up to the podium. The applause was a physical force, a wall of sound that seemed to make the very air vibrate. He leaned into the microphone, his voice booming with a confidence he hadn't earned. When I first envisioned the Sterling spire, Julian began, his hands gesturing grandly toward the massive architectural model behind him, I knew it had to be more than just steel and glass. I wanted to create a structure that spoke to the resilience of our family name. A structure built on integrity, innovation, and my own personal dedication to excellence. Maya felt a surge of cold, sharp adrenaline. She looked down at the ledger in her hands, then at her phone. A single notification sat on the screen, permit status, under review, fraud alert triggered. Julian continued his speech, weaving a fairy tale of his own genius, unaware that the ground was already shifting beneath his feet. He laughed at a joke he made, and the audience laughed with him, charmed by the golden sun of the Sterling Empire. Maya looked at her father, who was standing in the front row, his chest puffed out, his eyes shining with the reflected glory of his son's theft. He looked invincible. He looked like a king who had successfully buried the truth. She checked her watch. 10:05 a.m. The digital servers would be sending the automated notification to the Sterling Group's legal department in exactly 60 seconds. Wait for it, she whispered to the empty air. The high-definition screen behind Julian flickered. It was supposed to show a fly-through of the building's interior, a glossy marketing video designed to dazzle the investors. But as the countdown in Maya's head hit 0, the screen didn't show the lobby. It stalled on a red system error message that began to pulse in time with the frantic beating of her heart. Julian paused, his smile faltering as he glanced back over his shoulder. The audience began to murmur, the sound of 1,000 confused whispers rising like a tide. Maya gripped the edge of the ledger, her knuckles white. The hidden structure was finally coming to light, and the first crack in the Sterling Empire had just appeared. 10 minutes after the server crash, the auditorium had transformed from a temple of corporate worship into a den of panicked whispers. Maya Sterling watched from the shadows of the mezzanine as Julian scrambled to placate the investors, his face the color of spoiled cream. The red error message still pulsed on the massive screen behind him, a digital heartbeat signaling the end of an era he didn't even realize was dying. 2 hours later, the executive suite felt like a tomb. The scent of Julian's expensive, woodsy cologne had soured under the heat of his own cold sweat, filling the mahogany-lined office with the smell of failure. Arthur Sterling sat behind his desk, his fingers drumming a frantic, uneven rhythm on the leather surface. He didn't look up when Maya entered. The technicians say it was a localized surge, Julian stammered, pacing the length of the Persian rug. A freak occurrence. We can reschedule the presentation for after the gala tomorrow. The investors will understand. Arthur finally looked up, but his gaze didn't land on his son. He turned his predatory eyes toward Maya. You were in charge of the digital archives last quarter, he hissed, his voice a low vibration of redirected rage. This is your incompetence leaking into my son's moment. You probably tripped a wire with your clumsy handling of the legacy files. Maya didn't flinch. She felt the cool weight of the ledger in her bag, a physical anchor against his vitriol. The archives are perfectly intact, Father. Perhaps the system simply couldn't support the weight of the projections Julian was trying to force into it. Enough of your technical jargon, Arthur snapped, waving a dismissive hand. He stood, adjusting his silk tie with the casual arrogance of a man who believed the world would always reset itself in his favor. Go find something useful to do. The catering staff for tomorrow's gala needs supervision. Since you've proven you can't handle a computer, perhaps you can manage a tray of hors d'oeuvres. The injustice of it was a familiar sting, but today it tasted like a prelude to victory. Maya watched him, noting the way his hands shook slightly as he reached for his crystal decanter. The sound of the amber liquid splashing into the glass was the only noise in the room until Elinor Sterling swept in, her heels clicking like a countdown against the marble floor. Elinor didn't even look at Maya as she draped a hand over Julian's shoulder. Don't let her mood dampen your spirit, darling. It was a minor hiccup. Tomorrow night, when the Sterling name is immortalized on the new museum wing, no one will remember a flickering screen. She finally spared a glance for Maya, her eyes raking over Maya's simple charcoal blazer with visible disdain. Maya, dear, don't bother dressing up for the gala. We've decided it's best if you stay behind the scenes. You have a knack for being distracting in the wrong ways. I wouldn't miss it for the world, Elinor, Maya said, her voice like silk over a blade. In fact, I think tomorrow night will be the most transparent evening this family has ever had. Julian scoffed, a weak attempt at regaining his bravado. Transparent? It's a black tie event, Maya. Try to learn the difference between a gala and a construction site. Maya turned to leave, but paused at the door. She looked back at the three of them, the patriarch, the golden son, and the socialite, all huddled together in a fortress built on sand. A building only stands as long as its foundation is honest, she said quietly. You should check the load-bearing walls of this company, Julian. You might find they're thinner than you think. Arthur let out a short, mocking laugh. Go count the napkins, Maya. Leave the heavy lifting to the men. She exited the suite without another word, her heart beating with a steady, predatory calm. She made her way to the parking garage, where a silver sedan was idling in the darkest corner. Aunt Beatrice sat in the passenger seat, her face illuminated by the glow of a tablet. Is it done? Beatrice asked, her voice raspy but sharp. Maya reached into her bag and pulled out a small, encrypted thumb drive. It felt heavy with the weight of 5 years of stolen inheritance and buried legacies. The audit flag I triggered during the presentation was just the smoke. Tomorrow night, I'm bringing the fire. Beatrice took the drive, her eyes gleaming with a shared, bitter history. Arthur thinks he's invincible because he's never been challenged by someone who knows where the bodies are buried. He thinks I'm supervising the catering, Maya said, a small, cold smile touching her lips. Good, Beatrice replied, checking her watch. Let him keep his eyes on the menu. He won't see the ceiling falling until he's wearing the debris. Maya looked out at the city skyline, the Sterling Group logo glowing atop the tallest tower. 24 hours. In exactly 1 day, the countdown would hit 0, and the Sterling Empire would learn exactly what happened when the person they stepped on turned out to be the one holding the blueprints. She gripped the steering wheel, her knuckles white. The gala wasn't just a party, it was a funeral, and she was the one who had already dug the grave. The evening of the Sterling Anniversary Gala arrived with the kind of oppressive humidity that promised a storm, though the air inside the grand ballroom remained surgically chilled. Crystal chandeliers hummed with a low-frequency vibration, casting fractured light over 500 of the city's most influential figures. At the center of the swirling sea of silk and tuxedos stood Arthur Sterling, looking every bit the sovereign of a crumbling empire. He adjusted his silk bow tie in a gilded mirror, his reflection radiating the casual arrogance of a man who believed the world existed solely for his convenience. Maya Sterling watched him from the periphery, her form obscured by the shadows of a heavy velvet curtain. She wasn't wearing the floor-length emerald gown Beatrice had offered her. Instead, she wore the stark, anonymous black of the catering staff, a headset tucked discreetly into her hair. To the guests, she was invisible, a ghost in the machine of their opulence. To Arthur, if he noticed her at all, she was merely a tool he had finally found a use for. The vintage is breathing, the caviar is chilled, and the ego is reaching critical mass. Beatrice's voice crackled softly in Maya's earpiece. Maya didn't turn. She watched Elinor Sterling glide toward her husband, her neck draped in diamonds that had likely been purchased with the pension funds of the architects Arthur had laid off 3 months prior. Eleanor paused, her gaze raking over the catering staff with a look of profound distaste. She stopped near Maya, snapping her fingers without looking her in the eye. "You," Eleanor said, her voice like glass grinding on stone. "The lilies in the foyer are drooping. Have them replaced immediately." "It's a disgrace to have anything less than perfection on a night like this." "Of course, Mrs. Sterling," Maya replied, her voice a flat, obedient monotone. She kept her head bowed, hiding the cold fire in her eyes. "And find my son," Eleanor added, adjusting a stray hair on Arthur's lapel. "Julian was supposed to be greeting the board members 10 minutes ago. He's likely hiding in the library with a bottle of scotch because he's stressed. Tell him his father is losing patience." Maya nodded and moved away, the silver tray in her hand feeling like a shield. As she navigated the crowd, she passed Julian Sterling, who was indeed leaning against a marble pillar, his face flushed, and his speech already beginning to slur as he spoke to a group of potential investors. He was regaling them with a story about a brilliant design he had supposedly conceptualized for the new downtown high-rise, a design Maya had spent 6 months perfecting before he'd put his name on the blueprints. "It's all about the structural integrity of the glass," Julian bragged, gesturing wildly with a half-empty glass. "I told the engineers if you can't make it float, you aren't trying hard enough." The investors laughed, a sycophantic sound that made Maya's skin crawl. She moved past them, her fingers grazing the small, encrypted drive hidden in the pocket of her apron. The weight of it was a comfort. It contained the digital fingerprints of every bribe Julian had paid, and every safety regulation Arthur had bypassed to keep their projects under budget. She found Beatrice near the AV booth, looking regal in navy lace. They didn't speak. They didn't need to. Beatrice simply held up a champagne flute in a silent toast, her eyes fixed on the massive projector screen behind the stage where a tribute to the Sterling legacy was scheduled to play in 20 minutes. Maya moved toward the back of the room, entering the darkened tech corridor. The smell of ozone and heated electronics replaced the cloying scent of lilies and expensive perfume. Leo Vance was already there, his fingers flying across a laptop keyboard. He didn't look up as she approached, but his jaw tightened. "The firewall is down," he whispered, the blue light of the screen reflecting in his glasses. "I've bypassed Arthur's personal server." The moment he hits the play button on that remote, he won't be showing a slideshow of his childhood. He'll be showing the world the Sterling Group's real ledger. "Is the audio feed synced?" Maya asked, her heart thudding a steady, rhythmic beat against her ribs. "Every word Julian said to the auditors is queued up," Leo confirmed. "I've even got the recording of Arthur telling the board that you were emotionally unstable to justify removing you from the trust. It's going to be a very loud night." Maya looked through the small observation window back into the ballroom. Arthur was taking his place at the podium now, the spotlight catching the silver at his temples. He looked magnificent. He looked invincible. He tapped the microphone, the sound echoing through the hall like a gavel. The room fell silent, 500 heads turning toward him with practiced reverence. "Friends, colleagues, family," Arthur began, his voice booming with a warmth he didn't possess. 30 years ago, I stood in a small office with nothing but a dream and a name. Today, the Sterling name stands for something more. It stands for legacy. It stands for the future." He reached into his pocket and pulled out a small, silver remote. He held it up like a scepter, his smile widening as he looked toward the front row where Eleanor and Julian stood, beaming with unearned pride. "Tonight, I want to show you the heart of this company," Arthur said, his thumb hovering over the button. "I want to show you what happens when vision meets reality." Maya leaned closer to the glass, her breath hitching. She could see her father's thumb beginning to descend. She could see the board members leaning forward, ready to applaud the carefully curated lies of a man who had spent a lifetime erasing her. "Do it," Maya whispered to the darkness. Arthur pressed the button. The lights in the ballroom dimmed to a dramatic low, and the massive screen behind him flickered to life. But instead of the sweeping drone shots of Sterling Towers, a single, grainy document appeared. It was a bank transfer, dated 2 years ago, showing a 7-figure sum moving from the company's emergency fund into an offshore account in Julian's name. The silence that followed wasn't the silence of respect. It was the heavy, suffocating silence of a room full of people who had just seen a ghost. Arthur's smile didn't falter for a full 3 seconds. His brain simply refused to process the image. Then, the first whisper broke the air, followed by a sharp, collective gasp as the next slide appeared. A recorded transcript of Arthur's own voice, clear and cold, discussing the disposal of the evidence. Arthur turned, his face going a sickly shade of gray as he looked at the screen. He clicked the remote frantically, but the images only moved faster, a cascading waterfall of betrayal and theft. He looked toward the AV booth, his eyes wild, searching for someone to blame, someone to stop the bleeding. Maya stepped out from the shadows of the tech corridor, moving into the light of the ballroom's edge. She pulled the headset from her hair, letting her dark locks fall around her shoulders. She stood perfectly still, her gaze locked onto her father's crumbling expression. For the first time in her life, he was looking at her, truly looking at her. And for the first time in his life, Arthur Sterling looked afraid. The silence in the grand ballroom was absolute, a heavy, suffocating weight that seemed to press the very oxygen from the air. Maya moved with a predatory grace, her heels clicking a steady, rhythmic pulse against the cold marble floor that echoed like a countdown. She stopped 5 feet from the man who had spent a lifetime trying to erase her. Arthur Sterling didn't just pale, his face seemed to structurally fail. The skin around his jaw sagged, the carefully cultivated mask of the Sterling patriarch dissolving into a map of panicked wrinkles. His eyes, usually sharp and predatory, darted with the frantic rhythm of a trapped animal, the pupils blown wide against the harsh glow of the projector. A thin sheen of sweat broke across his forehead, catching the light of the crystal chandeliers, while his mouth worked soundlessly, like a fish gasping for air on a dry dock. The predatory wolf had been reduced to a shivering ghost of a man, his shoulders hunching as if he could physically shrink away from the truth. Julian Sterling let his champagne flute slip from his numb fingers, the crystal shattering against the marble with a sound like a gunshot. Eleanor Sterling took a deliberate step back, her hand flying to her throat as she looked at Arthur with a mixture of revulsion and calculation, already weighing the cost of her loyalty. Across the room, Aunt Beatrice offered a single, sharp nod of approval, her eyes gleaming with the satisfaction of a debt finally paid. Leo Vance, the family's lead counsel, stepped away from the Sterling inner circle, his face a mask of professional neutrality that signaled the end of his protection. "You're making a mistake, Maya," Arthur rasped, his voice cracking like dry parchment. Even now, with his crimes projected 30 feet high, the entitlement remained. "Think of the family. Think of Julian's future. You're destroying everything I built for a moment of spite." "I'm not destroying anything, Arthur," she replied, her voice a low, melodic contrast to his desperate wheeze. "I'm simply performing an audit, and it turns out you've been bankrupt for years." She reached into her slim clutch and pulled out a single, blue-backed folder. The scent of fresh ink and expensive bond paper wafted through the small space between them, cutting through the heavy perfume of the lilies decorating the tables. "The board met an hour ago, without you. Since the disposal of evidence you discussed on that recording involved their personal offshore accounts, they were remarkably eager to cooperate." Eleanor stepped forward, her voice trembling with a mix of fury and fear. "You can't do this, Maya. The Sterling name belongs to my son. You're a disgrace to your father's legacy." Maya didn't even look at her. Her gaze remained locked on Arthur, watching the final spark of hope die in his eyes. "The Sterling name belongs to whoever holds the majority stake, and as of 4 o'clock today, that would be me." She stepped forward, placing the folder into Arthur's shaking hands. The contact was brief, her fingers cold and steady against his damp skin. He looked down at the document, his breath hitching as he saw the notarized signatures of the very men he thought he controlled. He looked up, his expression a pathetic scramble for mercy, but Maya's face was a mask of tempered steel. "You spent 30 years building a legacy on my back, Arthur," Maya said, the words falling like heavy stones into the silence of the room. "I've spent the last 3 taking it back, brick by brick." She didn't wait for a rebuttal. She didn't stay to watch the security team, already visible at the ballroom entrance, move in to escort him out. She simply turned and walked toward the grand mahogany doors. Behind her, the first wave of whispers broke, a cacophony of judgment that would follow the sterling name for decades to come. She felt the weight of the past fall away, replaced by the cool, night air as she stepped out onto the terrace, leaving the wreckage of her father's empire behind. 10 minutes had passed since Maya Sterling stepped out of the ballroom, but the vibrations of the explosion she detonated still thrummed through the soles of her feet. She stood at the edge of the stone terrace, her fingers grazing the cold, ivy-covered railing. The night air was sharp, smelling of damp earth, and the expensive, lingering perfume of the guests she had just scandalized. Behind her, the muffled roar of the ballroom had shifted from a rhythmic party hum to a jagged, panicked cacophony. The heavy glass doors creaked open, spilling a bar of yellow light across the terrace. Maya didn't turn. She knew the heavy, uneven footfalls of the man approaching. They lacked the rhythmic authority they'd held for 30 years. "You think this is a victory?" Arthur Sterling's voice was a ragged shadow of its former self, vibrating with a desperate, suppressed rage. Maya finally looked at him, and for a moment, the sheer physical scale of his collapse stole her breath. Arthur's face was no longer the mask of calculated granite that had ruled the Sterling boardrooms for decades. It was a ruin. The skin around his jaw had gone slack, hanging in sallow folds that twitched with every ragged breath he drew. His eyes, once sharp and predatory, were now shot through with frantic red webs, darting toward the ballroom doors as if expecting a miracle that wasn't coming. A thin sheen of cold sweat coated his forehead, making the deep lines of his arrogance glisten under the terrace lights like open wounds. His mouth hung slightly open, the lower lip trembling uncontrollably, unable to form the lies that had always served him so well. He looked smaller, the expensive wool of his tuxedo suddenly appearing 2 sizes too large for a man who had been hollowed out from the inside. "It's not a victory, Arthur," she said, her voice as level as a horizon line. "It's an audit. I made you," he hissed, taking a stumbling step forward. He reached out as if to grab her arm, his fingers shaking, but he stopped when he saw the lack of fear in her eyes. "Everything you have, every connection, every cent, it belongs to the Sterling name, my name." "Actually," a new voice cut through the tension. Leo Vance stepped onto the terrace, a leather portfolio tucked under his arm. He didn't look at Arthur with the usual sycophantic deference. He looked at him like a specimen. "As of 19 minutes ago, the Sterling name is legally disentangled from the holding company, and the holding company is now majority-owned by Maya's private firm." Arthur spun around, his gaze frantic. In the doorway, a small crowd had gathered, silhouetted against the ballroom light. Julian stood at the front, his face a pale moon of confusion and burgeoning terror. He held a glass of scotch that tilted dangerously in his hand, a golden stain already spreading across his silk waistcoat. Eleanor was beside him, her fingers clawing at the pearls around her neck as if they were suddenly choking her. Her eyes were wide, scanning the terrace not for her husband's safety, but for the exits. Further back, Aunt Beatrice stood with her arms crossed. She didn't say a word, but the sharp, knowing glint in her eyes was a death sentence. 2 senior board members stood behind her, their expressions shifting from shock to a cold, professional distance. They were already mentally scrubbing Arthur's name from the building's lobby. "Julian," Arthur croaked, looking toward his son. Tell them she's lying, the signatures." Julian didn't move. He looked at his father, then at the board members, and finally at Maya. He saw the shift in the wind. "I told you we should have checked the filings, Dad," he muttered, his voice thin and pathetic. He stepped back into the shadows of the ballroom, effectively abandoning the man who had spent a lifetime shielding him from his own incompetence. Arthur turned back to Maya, his chest heaving. The sound of a distant siren began to rise from the base of the hill. a mournful, wailing climb that signaled the arrival of the authorities Leo had summoned. "You're destroying the family," Arthur whispered, a last-ditch attempt at guilt that fell flat in the cold air. "You'll be alone. Is it worth it? To sit in that office with no one to call your own?" Maya felt the weight of the last 3 years, the secret late-night meetings, the quiet gathering of evidence, the swallowed insults finally lift. She reached into her clutch and pulled out a small, silver key. It was the key to the Sterling family estate, the one he had threatened to take from her a dozen times. She stepped forward and pressed it into his trembling palm. The metal was cold, but his skin was unnervingly hot. "I'm not the one who's going to be alone, Arthur," she said, her voice dropping to a whisper that only he could hear. "I have the architects, the contracts, and the board. You just have the memories of a man everyone used to fear." She leaned in closer, her eyes locking onto his. "You told me once that I didn't belong at the head of the table. You were right. I didn't belong at yours, so I built my own." Maya didn't wait for his response. She didn't stay to watch the police officers step through the ballroom doors, or to see Alina finally turn her back on the man she had married for status. She turned and walked toward the stone stairs that led down to the private driveway. As she descended, the sound of Arthur's voice rose one last time, a high, cracked shout of her name that was quickly swallowed by the wind and the approaching sirens. She didn't look back. The smell of jasmine was stronger here, fresh and clean, masking the scent of the wreckage she was leaving behind. A black car was waiting at the curb, its headlights cutting through the dark. Maya stepped inside, the door closing with a heavy, final thud that silenced the world of Arthur Sterling forever. 6 months had passed since the night the Sterling name became a cautionary tale in the city's financial journals. Maya stood by the floor-to-ceiling windows of her new architectural firm, Sterling and Associates, a name she had reclaimed, scrubbed clean, and redefined. The air in this office didn't smell like the heavy, cloying jasmine of her father's estate. Instead, it smelled of fresh espresso, expensive ink, and the electric hum of a team that worked out of respect rather than fear. She watched the sun set over the skyline, the orange light reflecting off the glass of the very buildings she was now commissioned to redesign. Her hands, once prone to trembling in the presence of her father, were perfectly steady as she held a crystal glass of sparkling water. The condensation was cold against her skin, a sharp, grounding sensation that reminded her she was awake, she was present, and she was free. Aunt Beatrice sat in the leather armchair across from the mahogany desk, her sharp eyes scanning the room with a rare expression of peace. She looked younger now that she wasn't carrying the burden of the family's secrets. She set a manila folder on the desk, the final liquidation papers for Arthur's remaining assets. "He called me again yesterday," Beatrice said, her voice devoid of its former bitterness. "He wanted to know if I could talk to you. He's living in that 2-bedroom rental on the edge of the industrial district now. He told me the heater rattles so loud he can't hear himself think." Maya didn't feel the surge of triumph she had expected. Instead, she felt a dull, distant ache for the girl she used to be. She pictured Arthur, the man who once moved global markets with a mere whisper, shivering in a drafty apartment while Julian faced the reality of a suspended sentence and 3,000 hours of community service. Julian, the favored son who had been groomed for a throne he didn't earn, was now working a low-level desk job at a local insurance firm. He had only secured the position because the manager felt a fleeting sense of pity for Alina. Alina had been the first to flee the wreckage. As soon as the bank accounts were frozen and the social invitations stopped arriving, she had packed her designer luggage and moved to her sister's house in Florida. She had cited irreconcilable differences and emotional distress in her divorce filing, but everyone knew the truth. In Alina's world, a husband was only as valuable as his credit limit. She hadn't reached out to Maya once, not even to apologize for the years of cold dismissals. "And how is Arthur taking the news of the merger?" Maya asked, turning away from the window. "He's a ghost, Maya," Beatrice replied softly. "He spends his days at the public library or sitting on park benches where no one knows who he is. He's lost the weight, the tan, and that predatory roar in his voice. When I saw him last week to deliver the final papers, he couldn't even look me in the eye. He just kept staring at his bare ring finger, as if he was trying to remember where the gold went. Maya walked back to her desk and picked up a small, silver locket she kept in the top drawer, the only item she had taken from the Sterling estate before the locks were changed. Inside was a faded photograph of a 5-year-old girl sitting on her father's shoulders. They were both laughing, the world spread out before them like a promise. She had won. The empire was hers, the truth had been validated by the courts, and the villains had been humbled by the sheer weight of their own arrogance. But as the city lights flickered on below, Maya realized that justice was a cold companion. She had built her own table, just as she had promised, but the chairs around it were filled with colleagues, mentors, and allies, not the family she had once spent her life trying to please. The cost of her victory was the final realization that the father she loved had never truly existed. He was a construct of power and greed, and once those were stripped away, there was nothing left but a hollow man in a rattling apartment. "You did the right thing, Maya," Beatrice whispered, standing up to leave. "You saved the legacy by destroying the man who was poisoning it." "I know," Maya said, her voice steady but quiet. She closed the locket, the small click of the metal sounding like a final gavel. "But doing the right thing doesn't always feel like a celebration. Sometimes it just feels like the end of a long, exhausting war." She watched her aunt leave, then turned back to the blueprints spread across her desk. They were for a new community center in the neighborhood where she had spent her early childhood, a project funded by the very inheritance Arthur had tried to steal. She picked up her pen, the ink flowing smooth and black across the page. The Sterling name would mean something different now. It wouldn't stand for entitlement or betrayal. It would stand for the girl who survived the wolf and built something better out of the ruins. She began to draw, the sound of the pen on paper the only noise in the quiet, successful room.
I hope you enjoyed this tale. Please subscribe to support the channel. Goodbye for now.